Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. We would like to thank Stephen Friedman for being our speaker for such a long period of time, and we would like to thank you, the audience, for being with us weekly. Also, we would like to give big thanks to the US Consulate General here in Almaty and also American Space Almaty for organizing these talks weekly. Please make sure to give your comments, ask your questions, and we'll definitely address them in the end of the next session. And also today, we will address a few questions from the previous talks. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for the introduction. Thank you for your participation in these talks, as always, your ongoing participation. I also want to extend my thanks, as always, to the American Consulate in Almaty, to Dana, to Elmira, to the entire team that provides this platform for philosophical explorations of a broad range of issues, often, as I've mentioned, tied into international days of commemoration or celebration or recognition, sometimes days of that are talks are key to historical events, that are of particular significance, I think, or interest, that a philosophical perspective can provide enormous benefit, value, in our coming to terms with our daily lives and this strange experience called life. Again, the philosophical perspective is unique in that it is not a matter of opinion or point of view or theory or perspective or belief or faith. It's grounded in rigor, the limit of rigor, which means a philosophical proposition is aspiring only to incontrovertibility. That's the criterion, the test of philosophical value, and that ultimately is where philosophical power comes from. It's a philosophical space, as we might call it. A philosophical perspective is the safest of all places, the most secure of all places, because it's incontestable. By definition, at the limit of rigor, there is nothing stronger. So its propositions can stand in the face of any conceivable opposition. So it provides the firmest, most secure foundation to our lives. Philosophy establishes, articulates, reveals the reality in the way that science does not quite do, because, as I've talked repeatedly, controlled experiments are theoretically impossible at the limit of rigor. Religions represent systems of belief. Science represents a system of belief. Belief forms no part of philosophical representation. And again, that's where its power, its value, its ability to help us in the most desperate of circumstances lies. Well, today's talk, and I want to thank everybody for participating, for joining us, and as always, for your questions. I often don't leave as much time as I would like at the end to address questions, but I'm going to try to improve, and I'd like to devote more time than I typically do at the end of tonight's talk, or today's talk, to the questions from last time, about which they're good questions. The questions that people ask are always good questions, and they merit, a fairly detailed response. So that's what I'd like to offer today. Okay. The title of today's talk is Dignity, Empowerment, Compassion, the Philosophy of Social Justice. Now, it's a topic not key to a specific international day of celebration, though issues of dignity and empowerment do appear in many such days, many such events that we recognize. But it's actually inspired by an article I read in a newspaper in the New York Times that mentioned words that commonly appeared on billboards, especially in various regions in the southern part of the United States, in fact, near the Mexican border. And those words are dignity, empowerment, compassion, justice. And I thought, a perfect topic for a talk. Now, it would seem that that represents a broad set of topics, a broad set of terms and concepts and ideas to address. But as we see weekly, things are fairly well connected when you see them from a certain perspective. Typically, and that's the point of what I show weekly, typically from the perspective of these representations. I've mentioned frequently that propositions are either epistemic, incontrovertible, in the nature of philosophy proper, or they are heuristic. They are approximations that help us achieve certain ends or goals, achieve those ends or goals, whether it's mechanical flight through the design and invention of an airplane, whether it's rocketry, whether it's computer technology, whatever it might, whether it's agriculture, whatever it happens to be, through some convergence of elements. That's the nature of heuristic space. Propositions either belong to heuristic space, in which they're not incontrovertible, they can't be proven incontestably, they can't be known to be true in advance of their validation through actual experience. That's why we can't know that our conception of an airplane is going to fly until we build it. That's why we can't be sure that a drug that's developed by a pharmaceutical company works until we test it, until we try it. We can't know these things in advance. That's the nature of heuristic space, that there's no certainty, there's only possibility, as opposed to within epistemic space, there's absolute certainty, that absolute security of the incontrovertible. Okay, when this topic suggested itself, the philosophy of social justice, what immediately came to mind was a course and a professor from Harvard. The course was ethics. I took it about halfway through my undergraduate experience in philosophy. Actually, I took it at a point where I was moving away from philosophy. I had recently completed my Wittgenstein course, which was for me the acme of my philosophical work up to that time. I had explored Western philosophy, Eastern philosophies, the Hindu philosophical tradition at great length, as I've detailed in previous talks, starting from the time I was 12, actually. So by the time I got to Harvard, I had read through much of the Western philosophical tradition, the canonical tradition, the great works, the major works of Western philosophy, a lot of works of Eastern philosophy, works of the Analects of Confucius, Cheng-Shu, Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, works like that. And in the Hindu tradition, the Bhagavad Gita, and various works within the diversity of Hindu philosophical and religious exploration. But Wittgenstein, I had not yet explored. I wanted to wait until my college, until I was in a position to experience Wittgenstein through a major contemporary philosopher. In this case of Harvard, it was Stanley Cavell. But so once I finished that course, my focus was not so much on philosophy as it had been. I knew I had to take a break. I moved back into the sciences. I ended up transitioning into medicine, into molecular biology. And it was only a few years after that that I returned aggressively to philosophy. A professor of mine at Harvard, Rogers Albritton, had said, no one under 40 should get a PhD in philosophy, that one needs experience, one needs time to gestate ideas, to cultivate ideas, to develop ideas in relation to one's experiences, so one's not just writing philosophy in relation to what a philosopher had written in a journal, a week or a month or a year or a decade earlier. So that was my approach. So I wanted to allow time for my philosophical ideas to distill, to emerge. So when I took this ethics course, again, philosophy wasn't my focus, which was perhaps unfortunate. The professor of the course was John Rawls. John Rawls is considered one of the greatest moral philosophers in recent decades, one of the great moral philosophers since Immanuel Kant of the 18th century, who is in fact considered the greatest of all moral philosophers. People, philosophers to write on the nature of the good, the nature of justice, the nature of human dignity, of how we should act and why. So in other words, explorations not of the nature of reality, but of the nature of the good in human action. Rawls, who was a very modest man, very engaging, very easy to like, he actually had a stutter. So he was not intimidating at all. He was inviting in his presence. Soft-spoken, intelligent, so articulate, tall and thin, a very, oftentimes there's a severity to the personality of philosophy professors, at least that I've encountered. John Rawls had a much more, he was shy, as philosophers often are. Academicians often are shy. I've made the comment before that when I was a freshman in college, we were told during a freshman assembly that professors were approachable, but the student had to do the approaching because professors in general were more comfortable around books than they were around people. That was true of John Rawls. In fact, here's a photograph of him, just so you see, and it, I think, captures the spirit of the man against a wall of books. He lived an academic life, mostly, I think, at Harvard. Well, the point of this introduction to John Rawls is that when I was in his class, or that semester I was in his class, a work that he had been devoting his time, his efforts to for a number of years, many years, was published to great acclaim, great anticipation, great acclamation. That work is called A Theory of Justice. And as I mentioned, John Rawls is considered one of the great moral philosophers in the Western philosophical tradition, one of the great moral philosophers since Immanuel Kant, and his work, A Theory of Justice, is considered one of the greatest works in moral philosophy since Kant wrote a couple of hundred years earlier. Here's what the work looked like. Famously, it had a green cover. It was simple, A Theory of Justice. And I was fortunate enough to be in his class as that book had just been released. We were all reading it. It was a signed reading, and I was able to experience its ideas, its contents, its perspective from John Rawls himself. Now, the major contention of that book is justice as fairness, which has a pleasant feel to it, right? Fairness, we like the sound of that. It's actually a notion that goes back really to the time of Plato, where Plato's Republic was a major work in which he detailed what he considered to be a just society, a society that Rawls would consider to be organized according to the basic principle of fairness. Now, one of the things, though, to comment upon here is that notions of fairness are not inflexible. They can change over time. And the sense of fairness in Plato's Republic, written during the time of ancient Greece over, almost 2,500 years ago, is different than contemporary notions of fairness that govern our thinking about social justice today. In the case of Plato, justice, a fair organization of society, and Plato didn't use that word fairness. I'm using that word in consideration of Rawls's thinking, but it doesn't change the representation of what Plato was doing. For Plato, the fair, the just society was one in which everybody sort of assumed their appropriate role, their appropriate place within society, and contributed overall to the well-functioning, to the integrity, to the stability of that social organization. Plato lived in a time where categories of when anticipated or when embraced distinctions, fundamental distinctions among categories of things. And the best illustration of that, the most compelling for the worldview of Plato and for 2,000 years that would follow, is the physics of Aristotle. For Aristotle, there was a fundamental distinction between Earth, the world that we experience on a daily basis, where there's constant change, constant variety, constant commotion, and the heavens, where things are stable. The stars retain their positions. The stars, the heavens are an image of eternity, of changelessness, the kind of changelessness that Kierkegaard ultimately would associate with the concept of God, the unchangeableness of God, Kierkegaard would write centuries later. Well, Aristotle saw the heavens as made up of a different kind of substance, an unchangeable substance that accounted for the fact that there was no change beyond the atmosphere. The stars retained their relative positions year after year, reliably. Whereas on Earth, things change on a daily basis. So Aristotle saw a different substance as constituting Earth versus the heavens. So a fundamental distinction based upon the nature of those two realms. For Plato, that type of distinction applied to human beings, where people were born with different capabilities that suited them for different roles in society. It led to a stratified, a layered conception of how society should best be organized and ordered. And those strata, those levels within society were imagined to be fixed based upon one's inherent capabilities. The notion of social mobility, the ability to be born into a certain set of circumstances and rise through one's efforts, through one's efforts alone independent of one's intrinsic inherent abilities, was not something embraced in the world of Plato's Republic. It was not embraced in the physics of Aristotle. But the fundamental change came about, as many fundamental changes have followed, from the rise of modern science. And most importantly, the work of Newton. I've addressed this before, the idea that Newton looked at a falling apple, looked at the moon, and said to himself, not that, as Aristotle had done, the moon is a different type of substance than apples on earth. Different laws, different natures pertain to each. Newton generalized and thought to himself, gravity that's responsible for the fall of an apple could in principle be responsible for affecting the behavior of the moon. That the moon could be imagined to be falling into the earth in the way that an apple falls to earth. And then the question becomes, for Newton and for the development of modern physics, why doesn't the moon fall into the earth if gravity is pulling on it comparably to how gravity would pull on an apple? And Newton's answer was that the moon was falling, but instead of falling into the earth, was falling around the earth, but nevertheless falling under the pull of gravity, the same gravitational force operating under the same law of gravitational attraction that applied to an apple, that applied to human beings, that applied to every object with mass in the universe, in Newton's conception. So that eliminated the fundamental distinction between earth and heavens. And that movement towards a generalization of categorization, where we think in terms not of fundamental distinctions for our science, but fundamental similarities that allow us to apply the same laws in one realm on earth to another in the heavens. That type of thinking would ultimately be applied to societies, to our thinking about society, where with the French Revolution, most dramatically, the feudal structure of French society was cast out because of the Enlightenment thinking, the Enlightenment generalizing tendency of mind, influenced by Newtonian type physics, Newtonian thinking, where human beings who had been seen as fundamentally distinct, as belonging to separate classes of society, priests, educated class, the nobility, the peasantry. And if you were born into one, that established your place, your rank, your privileges, the laws that applied to you. Well, Newtonian physics threw that away, that mode of thinking away, when it came to considering the nature of objects on Earth versus in the sky. So, under the influence of that type of thinking, Enlightenment thinking, the 18th century philosophers thought in terms of an equality of representation, that human beings, rather than being fundamentally distinct according to classes, according to castes, according to strata, were fundamentally the same, were just as all objects with mass operated under the pull, the influence of gravity, so all human beings were seen as fundamentally equal within a social framework or fabric. And that changed the notion of fairness, so that the notion of fairness for Rawls was not a matter of recognizing the position into which one is born in society and honoring that and taking advantage of the stability that an embrace of such roles would provide for the society. But for Rawls, fairness represented some fundamental sense of human dignity that applied no matter what one's circumstance of birth, no matter what one's role within the society, that there was a greater consideration than the job that one did. There was one's status as a citizen, one's status as a human being within the society that had to be honored because of the recognition of this fundamental equality. Now, when I talk about equality in those terms, when I talk about equality in the sciences, when I talk about the type of equality that Newton saw between the moon and an apple, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about heuristic space, right? We're not talking about the nature of epistemic space, the nature of reality that recognizes distinctions to the point where concepts do not arise in the first place, so that there's no ranking. Remember, an epistemic space can be represented as this, where everything is radically distinct. Nothing is clustered together, not clustered together into categories of nobility or worker or priesthood or peasant or disenfranchised, none, or slave. None of these categories pertain within the absolute aconceptuality of epistemic space. So, when we are talking about the kind of views that Rawls espouses, he himself admits that he's providing guidelines for a just, a fair organization of society, guidelines within a certain conception of an equality among human beings. But again, that equality, epistemically, is approximate. And furthermore, that equality is serving a certain purpose, a certain end, the end of societal stability, ultimately. So, again, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with heuristic space. We have a goal. We have a goal of, if we're talking about the nature of society, we have a goal of establishing an enduring society, a society that's able to maintain itself over time. And Rawls is interested in conditions that will permit that. Conditions of fairness, but conditions of fairness within a contemporary world where we are seeing human beings as a society of equals as opposed to a society of role players, as Plato would have seen them. So when we are talking about what Rawls is offering, notice the title of his book, A Theory of Justice. One of the things that I've emphasized when talking about the nature of philosophy, one of the things that Wittgenstein emphasizes when talking about the nature of society, the nature of philosophy, is it has nothing to do with theories. I mentioned that at the beginning, right? We embrace philosophy because it's not elaborating presenting a theory, a point of view, a possibility, a set of beliefs, something that we might try on and see how it feels, what its effect might be, how effective it might be in helping us design a certain product, achieve a certain result. So from a technical standpoint, from the standpoint of the view of philosophy that I've been stressing as central to its power, central to the role it can most fruitfully play in our lives, what Rawls is offering is not philosophy, right? Philosophy does not deal with theories. Philosophy deals with incontrovertibilities. Insofar as Rawls is presenting a theory, he's presenting a heuristic that we try on and see if it works, ultimately. Now, turns out I don't remember very many specific comments that Rawls made in that class. I remember reading through A Theory of Justice. I had to read through it in order to take exams for that course. But I don't remember much of what Rawls said, and that's not unusual, right, in terms of what people say in different situations that rises to the level of the memorable, right? If you see a movie that you like, even if it's one of your favorite movies, one of the greatest movies, you might remember a line from that film. So when I look back on authors that I embrace, it might be one line that allows that author to rise to the highest level of regard, because that line represents a distillation of what that author has done. Obviously, you see my predilection, my embrace of the aphorism, right? I think it's a matter of being able to, if a single line, can avail us, can sum up, the entire perspective, of a lifetime, well, that's a more valuable result than writing volumes and volumes and volumes. I seek that level of distillation in my philosophical work. These formulations that I go back to repeatedly represent just that, right? But the one comment that Rawls made that has stayed with me, and that relates to this notion of his presenting a theory, and so one not necessarily knowing if the theory will turn out to be valid under all possible sets of circumstances. One day, and I don't remember what elicited this remark, but his comment specifically was, somebody had asked him, what would we think or do under some imagined set of circumstances that this individual was proposing? I don't remember what those circumstances were. But Rawls's response is what matters. And that is, if circumstances change sufficiently, if we encounter something sufficiently different from what we've encountered in the past, in no matter what setting we encounter it, socially or otherwise, well, we won't know what to say. We won't know what to do. That a theory can only guide us so far and in relatively familiar terrain. When that terrain becomes sufficiently different from what we're familiar with, from what we have known, we will be at a loss. That is the difference between a theoretical result and a philosophical result. As I've stressed, a philosophical result applies here and now and independently of all possible future experience, no matter what. That's why it pertains at such a high level of generality. It's a matter of, well, what? A divergent space where any 2 points, any 2 experiences are radically distinct. It is an aconceptual space. Rawls was working within a conceptual space, a heuristic space, and he was offering guidelines for experiences that were more or less familiar to us based upon our more or less retaining our identity, our nature. Philosophy rigorously doesn't operate within that space, right? The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. Is this world real or dream? Well, if tomorrow we awaken to a totally different reality, this was dream. That's the nature of future experience. That's the nature of the reality that we confront. That's why philosophy is so effective at undermining our expectations that imprison us. We're going to talk about that a little bit later when I talk about the issue of empowerment. Philosophy is the ultimate empowerment because it's the ultimate device of freedom. And the freedom that it provides is freedom from the past, which also at the same time frees us from expectation. And that's the liberation that laughter represents. We talked the other week about the laughter that precedes enlightenment. Well, it's the laughter that represents a freeing from expectation, the prison of expectation, the prison that we impose upon our lives from generalizing from past experience. Well, Rawls's work is seen as relating to the previous work of Kant, Immanuel Kant, that greatest of all moral philosophers. And we don't have the time to explore Kant's work in depth, and we don't need to. I wanted to focus upon really the most essential aspect of it, where Kant tries to put his finger on the ultimate nature of human dignity. Dignity is the first term in that billboard, right? Dignity, empowerment, compassion they wanted to address. Kant felt that ultimately human dignity was a matter of treating human beings not as means to some specific result, but as ends in themselves. So in other words, not seeing human beings as serving a role, serving a purpose, but as representing just the ultimate purpose in and of themselves. So we don't exist because we benefit somebody else. We don't exist because we benefit a company. We don't exist even because we benefit a society. We exist as ultimate value, an end in ourselves, so that we are not a tool, we are not a slave, we are not a cog in a wheel, we are not defined by a role. We are, again, as Kant would put it, an end in ourselves. It's a way of saying we don't exist in our dignity in relation to a specific role. Obviously, this is a view radically different from the view of Plato, radically different from how people had seen societies as being structured legitimately in feudal systems of social organization. But again, a view that shows the influence of the Newtonian revolution, a generalizing tendency recognizing a fundamental equality of dignity among human beings. Now, Kant comes to that position by analyzing the nature, the notion of human dignity. We can get there in what I consider to be an even more fundamental way. And this provides the really explanation, explication, the ultimate justification for that Kantian view. Human beings as ends, not as means, serving some purpose. And the way we can represent it is human beings, and not just human beings, every existing thing, epistemically, is an end in and of itself. Heuristically is a means to some end. In other words, the epistemic heuristic distinction provides a way to come to terms and to represent that fundamental Kantian notion of morality and human dignity. The idea that epistemically we, as everything else, is an end, an existential end, something that has equal dignity to everything else because one can't rank, one can't compare, one can't place into juxtaposition. For comparisons, that's a convergent process. An epistemic space is a divergent space that doesn't allow comparisons, doesn't entertain things being brought together for the purpose of ranking and comparisons and measurements. The space in which we measure, the space in which we compare, the space in which we bring things together, the space in which we operate to achieve certain ends or goals like a stable society is a heuristic space. So we can say broadly and deeply and completely that we, human beings, are ends epistemically, means heuristically, insofar as we are seeing human beings as operating to help achieve a given social purpose, a given result. Whether that result might be a product that a company is developing that we're contributing our efforts to, our ideas, our labor, our time to. Whatever that result is, we have a heuristic role in relation to it. But remember, the ultimate reality, recognized rigorously philosophically, is not heuristic. The ultimate reality is epistemic. And so the ultimate nature that we embrace is of a dignity that is inviolate, because it is grounded in a rigorous reality that doesn't permit comparisons. So, epistemically, we are ends. Heuristically, we are means to some end. And that, when Kant was writing that, epistemic heuristic distinction didn't exist. When Rawls was writing, it didn't exist. So we can see how powerful that formulation is and how clarifying it is. What's our fundamental nature, our true nature, our epistemic nature? Well, it is an irreplaceability. We can't, any two things are rigorously distinct. One thing can never substitute for another. Our dignity is absolute. But heuristically, we're approximately the same. One person can more or less do the job of another person. One person can more or less play a certain role within a company, within a society that somebody else plays. Only approximately so, not rigorously so. So our dignity is our singularity. And our dignity is ensured by the nature of existence itself, that we exist in distinction from everything else. And so, and again, rigorously, any difference is decisive. So any difference between me and anyone else, between you and anyone else, even in where you're positioned, ensures your essential dignity because it ensures your distinctiveness. And dignity is grounded, existence is grounded in that distinctiveness. We can abandon it, or we can, again, assume a role, put on a uniform, adopt a role within a company, within a society, for a certain purpose. But we always should recognize that we're doing it heuristically for some purpose. Our ultimate nature is not that role. Our ultimate nature is not defined by that end that heuristically we are serving or working towards. Our ultimate nature is defined by our epistemic dignity, what allows us to exist at all. And it applies not just to human beings, it applies to everything. Now, these basic ideas are capitulated, summarized, in a section from Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World. Let me recite it. So it's, again, capitulating, summarizing what I've just said. You'll hear it from, again, a slightly different perspective, a slightly different formulation. I think it's always helpful to encounter these ideas in a variety of ways, a multiplicity of ways. That's how we gain perspective and understanding when it comes to a particular result. What 2 points have in common forms a heuristic space. It's the space of science and technology and society and political life, where two things are approximately equal for certain purposes, as the interchangeable parts of a cell phone or workers in a factory. How 2 points differ forms an epistemic space. It is precise and rigorous, that 2 points are not one. It's the space of reality in which we exist in difference from everything else. It's the space of fundamental dignity in which one thing cannot take the place of another. It's the space in which concepts do not arise, and so in which the riddle of the world, itself a concept, does not arise. It's the space of salvation that religions have sought and that philosophy incontestably establishes. So again, we see the power of these ideas relating to the nature of epistemic, philosophic, rigorous space, a space defined by distinction and distinctiveness and difference, a divergent space where things do not come together for any purpose, versus a convergent space, a heuristic space where two things are approximately the same. Two individuals working for a company have approximately the same role, are performing approximately the same function for some specific purpose. But our dignity is within the epistemic, within the conditions of existence itself. See how secure philosophical space is? It's absolute. It's unchallengeable. That's the nature of rigor. Now, when we're talking about society, we're talking about a convergent structure, right? We're talking about bringing individuals together. We're talking about individuals that are coherent. Anytime we're talking about a group of elements that are together or brought together for some purpose or other, well, we're talking about heuristic space. We're not any longer within the realm of the incontrovertible, the rigorous, to use a religious metaphor, the redemptive, right? Well, now, one of the things that philosophers have long speculated about is what's the value of society in and of itself, ultimately. And this is something that anthropologists, that archaeologists, that historians, that scientists, and philosophers have commented upon extensively. Famously, there is the work of the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who wrote that in a state of nature, like prior to the development of society, of social systems, well, life is, famously, he wrote, nasty, brutish, and short. It echoes the perspective of Pascal, the philosopher who commented upon how frail human beings were in a state of nature, without the protections of society, without the elaborations of technology, of homes, of all the devices that protect us against this wild world. Now, Pascal didn't like people. He commented, mankind naturally hates each other. It's not quite grammatical, but I think that is how it's been translated, so I quote it in that way. But he recognized that human beings in and of themselves could not contend well with the challenges, the threats of nature. He felt that what gave us a decisive survival advantage was our minds, that we were as frail as reeds, reeds like frail grasses in a swamp, but as thinking reeds, we had the ability to compete and to flourish. Well, what Pascal didn't quite appreciate, because philosophy hadn't developed to the point to allow us to appreciate this, that in order to think, we need language. And what facilitates our survival in a state of nature are social systems, where we can come together and compete against nature and defend ourselves as a collective body against its threats. What allows for that social coordination is language. That's the fundamental function, the fundamental survival value of language itself. Language doesn't exist to communicate ideas that we are struggling to communicate in the absence of language. In the absence of language, we have no ideas. It's only within societies that are facilitated by linguistic forms, linguistic structures, that ideas can develop because they have, if you like, a vehicle. So when Pascal talks about our capacity to survive as thinking reeds, what he's really referencing, what we now recognize his having referenced, is our ability to survive in society. And in societies, we are able to function because of the coordination that language allows, that language provides. Now, there is within, so when we look at like the world that Hobbes represented. We see like a hostile world where society is necessary to facilitate human survival. Other ideas that emerged a little bit later, ideas of Locke and Rousseau, the English philosopher John Locke, the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, emphasized that within societies as they presently existed, there were issues, problems of unfair structurings of that society. Famously, Jean-Jacques Rousseau began his work, The Social Contract, which contributed decisively to the French Revolution, not so much the American Revolution. That was influenced more by the ideas of John Locke, but they were comparable ideas, even though they used a little bit different language. But Rousseau stressed, quote, "Man is born free, and he is everywhere in chains." Rousseau looked at a state of nature and found it a type of primal paradise, a type of Eden, that we relinquished for societies that didn't always ultimately serve our best interests. So we were enchained within society, whereas in a state of nature, in a state of Eden, we were in a type of paradise and fundamentally free from any mode of constraint that society imposes in order to maintain its integrity, its stability. So Locke and Rousseau were interested in formulating the conditions of a just society, a just social organization. And the ultimate condition of that was a type of voluntary contract, that we give up our state of nature, our primal state of freedom, for the constraints of society. We have to obey certain laws, regulations. We have to coordinate our behavior with others for the benefits that society offers. The benefits that, again, Hobbes and Pascal would see as facilitating survival. But it was contractual. So if the society, if the government didn't fulfill its end of the bargain and didn't provide a set of conditions that were honoring, our dignity, honoring our original dignity in a state of nature, then we had the right to replace that social organization. We had the right to replace that government with something that would better serve our needs. And the contemporary societies of France and the United States represent attempts at achieving degrees of social justice, equality, dignity, where in the case of, both societies, individuals have a right to vote, and it represents an equal vote among all the other voting members of the society. So it recognizes a certain fundamental, again, equality of dignity. Now, clearly, historically, the vote hasn't been universal. And one of the historical arcs that's prominent in the United States is the expansion of what's called the franchise, the right to vote, so that individuals, groups that were excluded historically are more and more included. That includes women, that includes, slaves, in the 19th century, were not even seen as human beings entitled to, or as citizens entitled to, a right to cast a vote. So we've expanded the franchise to expand equality, to expand the embrace of the dignity of the individual, to allow a greater sense of equal participation within the society that serves, again, ultimately under the spell of the work of Newton, that serves this generalizing tendency where we are defined more by our equality as citizens within the society than by our roles serving that society. Law is part of what promotes this sense of equality, right? Equality under the law, that everybody is going to be treated by the law equally under comparable situations. Now, again, when we're talking about the law and we're talking about comparable situations, when we're talking about laws generally, we're talking about heuristic structures, right? We're talking about two situations being approximately the same for some purpose or other. So we're not talking about the radically distinctive and divergent epistemic space. We're talking about a societal space in which things are approximately the same for the purpose of recognizing an equality under the law. It's what's ultimately responsible for that notion, that famous notion. Oh, photographs. I have photographs. Okay, I mentioned Immanuel Kant, that human beings should be treated as ends, not as means. There's Immanuel Kant. Showing you that. Here is a painting of Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher who emphasized the brutality of a state of nature. Here is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who stressed that a state of nature was really a type of paradise that we had given up for the shackles of society. And so we had to go out of our way to make sure that that society was honoring our fundamental dignity. Okay. The law is operating heuristically. Two things will be approximately the same for some purpose or other. What we most famously represent the law as is blind. Justice is said to be blind. If you can see that sculpture, which is outside the Supreme Court building of the United States, the woman, Justice, has a blindfold. The idea is she is not paying attention to distinctions. She's treating people as equal for the adjudication, the decision-making process within the law. She is not recognizing, taking into account one's social status. She's not taking into account one's background, one's education, one's familial connections, the college one went to. She's only taking into account the specific circumstances of the case that bear upon the just execution of the law. Now, again, we're then obviously dealing within a heuristic context, not a rigorously philosophical one. So there's an arbitrariness here. And it's best, I think, appreciated by just briefly considering aspects of legal standards of judgment, of decision-making. If you're involved in a civil conflict with somebody, let's say a neighbor has damaged your property or something, so you were interested in receiving some remuneration. you're interested in being paid back, and your neighbor refuses to pay for the damage, so you go to court. It's a civil case. It's not criminal. Someone hasn't been physically harmed, physically assaulted, but property has been damaged. So it's a civil case. The outcome will be to reward monetary damages or compensation. In a civil case like that, the standard is a preponderance of the evidence. It's a heuristic situation. We are weighing the evidence that bears upon one individual relative to the evidence that favors the other. And we decide, that's what the scales are showing us, which one has the greater weight of evidence. And whichever one has the greater weight of evidence, that's the one that wins the case. A preponderance of the evidence. That's a low standard within the law. In a criminal case, where someone is accused of a crime of murder, let's say, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a higher standard, a higher level of adjudication. We want not just the evidence to slightly tilt in the direction of guilt, we want it substantially in the direction of guilt. We want an overwhelming amount of evidence. We want to be confident, again, beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, philosophically, the standard is the ultimate in judgment, the ultimate standard which is beyond all possible doubt. That's the nature of rigor. That's the nature of philosophical demand. That's how philosophy ultimately serves our needs decisively, by achieving the conditions, again, of a rigorous epistemic space. No doubt whatsoever. It's the highest possible standard. So that's the difference between the heuristic and the epistemic. Now, it's kind of interesting too, when there was, in the history of law, Aristotle is considered the greatest of all legal minds. He was a philosopher, but the greatest of all legal minds. Philosophy is seeing things from such an elevated perspective that it's capable of forming very precise judgments that are harder to achieve within or at lower levels of discernment. When I was an undergraduate, I would go up periodically to Harvard Law School, and I would sit in on seminars in constitutional law. Now, I wouldn't say anything because I was just observing. I was auditing. I was a visitor. I didn't feel it was my place to say anything, even though my background was philosophy. There would be long discussions about issues relating to constitutional law. And what was always intriguing to me was that philosophically, one could see the solution almost immediately. That's the perspective that philosophy provides. That's the perspective at that level of ultimate rigor. I never, again, offered my perspective, my results, but I would come away from those seminars and encapsulate everything that had been discussed in an hour and a half of such a seminar in one aphorism. So again, that's the power of philosophy. That's why Aristotle has the historical rank and regard that he does. And again, it's the role that philosophy also plays with respect to evaluations of science that are operating at a lower level of rigor. Okay, I want to move on here. I know I'm going to run out of time again, but I wanted to make a few comments about the nature of language as it applies here. There are lots of situations within the law, within issues relating to social justice, various types of social concerns, where we're making distinctions between human beings, between a person and a child, between we have considerations as to when life begins that affects issues within the law. Well, one of the most important things to keep in mind, and we won't have time to go into this in depth, but I will, I think, in another talk. A lot of these issues, a lot of these legal issues, a lot of these social issues are grounded in a failure to understand the nature of language itself. That concepts do not have precise boundaries, that there is no ultimate way to decide what constitutes a human being, what constitutes a living versus a non-living thing. Concepts do not exist within sharp boundaries. We can impose such boundaries, but when we do, they are imposed arbitrarily. So when the discussion is about at what point does life begin, it's an arbitrary discussion, fundamentally, philosophically, that represents a failure to recognize the nature of concepts themselves. I wanted to make that comment quickly. Now, we've talked about dignity. We've talked about dignity being grounded in the singularity of our circumstance, in what distinguishes us from everything else, and so it makes us into ends, existentially, epistemically, not as roles serving some purpose. That is how we would function heuristically. In terms of empowerment, I've mentioned in previous talks the power of philosophy to free us from the past, the power of philosophy to free us from expectation, the power of philosophy ultimately to free us from fear, the fear that's grounded in senses of need, presumed senses of the world, of the nature of our experience. I've stressed aphoristically, we suffer not because what we know, not because what we do not know, not because what we cannot know, but because what we think we know, unjustifiably. Or we suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. Or selflessness, how one acts not out of need, which frees us from fear, which freed me from my acrophobia, my agoraphobia. I've detailed that, in past talks. It relates to that famous remark of Gandhi's: God cannot appear where there is hate or shame or fear. The ultimate empowerment is that which places us in a situation where we do not hate, do not have shame. We embrace our dignity, do not have fear relative to a sense of need that is being thwarted. And that is what the power, the rigor of philosophy is able to achieve, to free us from those constraints. And finally, quickly, in terms of compassion, my website, thebooksofjoshua.com, begins with an aphorism. No one asked to be born. No one deserves to suffer. That, for me, is the fundamental condition of compassion. It also relates to, or our epistemic circumstances also relates to our inability legitimately, rigorously to judge. We cannot know another's circumstances. We cannot know another's temptations. We cannot know another's weaknesses internally, from the inside. We cannot know well enough to evaluate rigorously. We hear religiously the admonition, "Thou shalt not judge." But we can give that a rigorous philosophical grounding, in the sense that any distinction between our circumstance and that of another is such that we cannot know that other person's circumstance sufficiently to evaluate. It's often said, in order to judge someone, you need to walk in their shoes. You need to walk a mile in their shoes. That's not good enough. You would have to be able to live within their skin. And that's not good enough. You'd have to be born within their skin and experience all of their circumstances to know what they are confronting, what their temptations are, before you are in a position to rigorously evaluate their situation and circumstance and yield a legitimate judgment. It's impossible rigorously. And that's one of the most important aspects of philosophy to recognize, to embrace. The illegitimacy of the judgment of another because of anything that distinguishes us from the circumstances of another. There's a comment I wanted to read. It's by an early American serial killer, Holmes, who was executed about, the anniversary of his execution was like a week or so ago. That's how I encountered this comment of his. There is Holmes, not that he needs to be celebrated. And what he said was, and he was executed in 1896 for serial killings. What he said in confessing to his crimes, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer. No more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." Now you can say, well, don't we have free will? Can't we resist these temptations? You don't know another's temptations. The Talmud Commentary on the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Let me show you what the Talmud looks like. It's a many-volumed work. And here is a set of volumes of the Talmud Commentary on the Bible. Emphasizes that if someone doesn't have certain temptations that might lead them to commit criminal acts, well, they can't be praised for not having those temptations. It's the individual who has the temptations and resists them. But we don't know the strength of someone's temptations. For all we know, a serial killer that might have been responsible for a dozen murders might have done all he or she could to prevent themselves killing 50 people, 100 people. We don't know the strength of another's temptations because we cannot put ourselves in their circumstances. Now, clearly, for the purpose of societal safety, security, for protecting others, we will impose a prison sentence. We will do things to protect society. But in terms of the exercise of compassion, that extends universally, again, because we cannot know. And no one asked to be born. No one asked to be born with the tendencies to be a serial killer. No one asked to be born as Holmes was born. And so our compassion extends philosophically to all of those individuals grounded in that fundamental circumstance. No one asked to be born. No one deserves to suffer. Now, I want to read something as a kind of summary, one of my aphoristic works, before I get to the questions quickly from last time. The aphoristic work that is very concentrated, it's poetic. It's, again, not easy to understand without explication, but I read it partly for the sound and partly so you can experience a little bit of how I mostly write philosophy. What I'm presenting in these talks is commentary on my philosophical workings that are aphoristically expressed. So here is the book. It's an aphoristic book. It's short. Inconceivable grace, that's the title page. Inconceivable graces from dubious spaces. And let me read. 1. Dubious spaces. Symmetries are deletions to extinction over which concepts range, massed by conditions energy, reductively to change. Objects reveal strong symmetries. Strong symmetries seal identities. Heuristics reify ontology. Fixed possibility supports objectivity, obfuscating reality. And then the second section, inconceivable graces. Divinity pertains short of its extremity. Salvation transparencies pointwise opacity. Heuristics inform dubious spaces. Epistemics contour divinity's faces smilingly to inconceivable graces. Okay, again, it's concentrated, it's philosophy in aphoristic form, poetically expressed, so it's as concentrated as writing I've ever encountered, but again, the sound, I think, conveys some of the meaning. Okay, let me quickly, again, I have more time, so I'm going to address, there were two main questions from last week, and let me address them as best I can. First question is about, what do you think about Yuval Harari, his theory and humanism? Okay, now, Harari is I think, an Israeli historian primarily, also a philosopher. He's a public intellectual. He has a website that presents his ideas. He's also famous for a couple of books that have been bestsellers on the history of humanity. It's a little bit similar to Hawking's A Brief History of Time, except it's a brief history of the evolution of human beings. I have not read his major books. And so my comments are limited in terms of the perspective I can offer. I did go and look at his website. He does have some extensive excerpts. I assume that the excerpts he's chosen are excerpts that he feels represents his work. Now, a couple of things. I don't like to be critical, and I do impose very high standards. I impose high standards when I evaluate the work of other philosophers. I impose high standards equally upon myself. And I'm always honest in my assessments. Much of what I saw on Harari's website is evolutionary theory. A lot of his work is influenced by his background in history as a historian. I've actually read an article by him in The Guardian. The Guardian is has a liberal perspective. It was an article on the Ukraine crisis, but from a particular point of view, kind of a Western point of view. These talks are not meant to be political, and I don't like to discuss political ideas because they don't rise to the level of philosophical rigor. What I was looking for when I was reading excerpts from his writings, and he writes well, and I think that there's a lot to learn from his works. I was looking for things that rose to high philosophical levels of representation, and that I didn't find, to be honest. I read his account of Buddhism, and Buddhism is something that I detail. I explore its roots in terms of a syllogistic logic. I found a more superficial account of Buddhism. A lot of what I found within Harari's writings, I thought was, well, not what I would consider purely philosophical, not rising to a level of rigor. I'm not sure that he's exposed to my work, that he's exposed to as much of the Western analytical tradition, the tradition of Wittgenstein, the analysis of language as I have. He does refer a lot to scientific results, but I get the sense that it's someone writing about science who's not themselves a scientist. So there was a book I read when I was in high school, History as Art and as Science. It had an enormous influence upon me at the time. I see history as more of an art, literally as literature, and having a heuristic value. Again, one of the main issues of rigorous philosophical representation is the past cannot guarantee the future. It's not a definitive guide. Any distinction between past circumstances and present circumstances means that what has happened in the past does not rigorously apply to the present. We can use it as a guide. We can use it to generate literature, but it doesn't in general rise to the level of rigorous philosophical representation. And that's what I felt about his work largely. Now, the other question I was asked about how are biometric determinism and Friedman philosophy connected? Okay, and biometric determinism, like the use of, it really falls under a broader category of biological determinism. Biological determinism relates to philosophical freedom in the way that any scientific result does. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be more quick in dealing with this, that ultimately these are theories. These are devices that may help us in some way, help us predict, but not rigorously so. Right? That any set of distinctions between any two human beings means that what applies to one does not rigorously apply to the other. And that is absolute from a philosophical perspective. So there will be aspects of any biological theory that will have predictive value, more or less predictive value, but it reminds me, I watch squirrels. You know, I feed squirrels. I'm fascinated by squirrels because they live in arboreal life. They live in trees. We evolutionarily came from trees, and they are less complex than we are as organisms in a certain sense. But what's interesting to me is that I've noticed from the beginning of my feeding them or interacting with them on a daily basis, they're not predictable. You would think that I'm offering them food, I'm offering them nuts. You'd think that the same squirrels might come day after day at the same time. No. They might come for a couple of days in a row at a certain time, and then there's variation. So as much variation as there is among squirrels, there's even greater variation among human beings, given, again, our trenchant differences one to the other. Even identical twins have more differences than similarities between us. And so ultimately, biological determinism breaks down within the singularity of our circumstance. Okay, I think that will do it. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining. I want to thank everybody for the questions. I really appreciate these questions, and continue to ask questions, and I will continue to answer them. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you very much, Stephen, for the talks, and thank you for joining us weekly. We truly appreciate your efforts and help. Also, thank you, the audience, for being with us. Thank you for your questions. We see all the feedback, all the thumbs up, and everything. Also, we do have a few questions today that we'll address definitely in the next week. Goodbye, everyone. Stay safe, and thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah. Thank everybody for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.